The rain hammered relentlessly against the windshield as Alicia's car crept along the winding road, her headlights barely piercing through the dense fog. The GPS had given up several miles back, and the hand-drawn map she'd picked up from the realtor was smudged and soggy, its ink bleeding into useless blotches. Yet there was something about the town of Blackwood that called to her, a whisper at the edge of her thoughts, pulling her into its shadowed embrace. She tightened her grip on the steering wheel, her knuckles turning pale. The eerie silence of the surrounding woods was broken only by the occasional rustle of unseen creatures and the groaning of ancient branches swaying under the storm's weight. Blackwood was a small, unassuming town nestled in a forgotten corner of the Pacific Northwest, bordered by thick forests and mist-covered hills. It was the kind of place people came to disappear or to escape something they couldn't face. For Alicia, it was both. Her new home, a sprawling Victorian house perched on the outskirts of town, finally emerged from the murk as her car crested a hill. The sight of it made her stomach churn. The house was far larger than she'd expected, its turrets and gabled roof looming against the storm-lit sky. A crooked wrought-iron fence encased the overgrown yard, and the faint flicker of a porch light offered the only sign of welcome. Even from a distance, she could see the peeling paint and sagging shutters, scars of abandonment etched into its bones. She parked in the driveway, the engine sputtering into silence as she cut the ignition. For a moment she sat in the quiet of the car, the storm's roar muffled by the thin steel walls. A deep breath did little to steady her nerves. Her past cases had taught her to trust her instincts, and right now they were screaming at her to leave. But Alicia was no stranger to fear, and she wasn't about to let a dilapidated house or a sinister vibe scare her off. Pulling her coat tightly around her, she stepped out into the rain and retrieved her suitcase from the trunk. The wind snatched at her hair and drenched her within seconds, but she pressed on, her boots squelching against the muddy path to the front door. The key, cold and tarnished, slid reluctantly into the lock. With a firm twist, the door creaked open, revealing a yawning darkness that seemed almost alive. The air inside was stale and heavy, carrying the faint scent of mildew and something sweeter, like decayed flowers. Her flashlight beam danced across faded wallpaper, dusty furniture shrouded in white sheets, and a grand staircase spiraling into the gloom above. She could hear the faint drip of water from somewhere deep within the house, an irregular rhythm that set her teeth on edge. "Home, sweet home," she muttered, forcing a smile that no one would see. She dropped her suitcase by the door and ventured further in, her footsteps echoing in the cavernous space. The realtor had assured her the house was structurally sound, but as she tested the creaking floorboards, she wondered if they'd ever actually set foot inside. Still, the price had been unbeatable, and the idea of starting over in a town like Blackwood had been too tempting to pass up. After a quick exploration of the main floor, she found the kitchen. The ancient stove and chipped countertops spoke of a bygone era, and a single bulb hung from the ceiling, swaying slightly in an unseen draught. She flipped the switch, and the light sputtered to life, casting long, flickering shadows across the room. She set her flashlight on the counter and pulled out her phone, checking for service. As expected, there was none. Perfect, she sighed, setting it to airplane mode to conserve battery. A sudden crash from upstairs froze her in place. The sound was sharp, metallic, like a heavy object being dragged across the floor. Her heart pounded in her chest, but her years as a detective had trained her to suppress panic. Grabbing the flashlight, she slowly made her way to the staircase, her footsteps careful and deliberate. "Hello?" she called out, her voice steady despite the fear clawing at her throat. "Anyone there?" The silence that followed was deafening. She climbed the stairs, each creak of the wood beneath her feet reverberating through the house. At the top, the hallway stretched out before her, its dim expanse lined with closed doors. The air was colder here, and she could feel the weight of the house pressing down on her, as if it were watching her every move. The flashlight beam caught a glint of something at the end of the hallway. A door slightly ajar, its knob gleaming faintly. Alicia approached cautiously, her free hand resting on the knife she always kept clipped to her belt. The room beyond was small, barely more than a closet, its only occupant an antique mirror leaning against the far wall. The glass was cracked, the fracture lines spreading out like a spider's web, and her reflection stared back at her with a warped, distorted intensity. For a brief moment, she thought she saw movement behind her in the glass, but when she spun around, the hallway was empty. "It's just an old house," she whispered to herself, though the words felt hollow. Still, she couldn't shake the feeling that something in Blackwood, something in this house, was waiting for her. And whatever it was, it had no intention of letting her leave unscathed. Alicia stirred from a fitful sleep, her body heavy and her mind clouded. She hadn't intended to fall asleep on the faded couch in the parlour, but the oppressive exhaustion of the move and the house's eerie silence had weighed her down. Dreams, fragmented and unsettling, clung to her memory. Visions of shadowy figures moving just beyond her reach, whispers that spoke in a language she didn't understand. A faint beam of pale morning light streamed through the cracked curtains, illuminating the room in a ghostly glow. The rain had stopped, leaving the air thick and humid, with the faint scent of damp wood hanging like a veil. She sat up, rubbing her temples, and glanced around the room. Everything looked the same as the night before, yet something felt subtly wrong. Her stomach growled, pulling her from her thoughts. The kitchen offered little solace. The fridge was empty, save for a half-empty bottle of water she'd brought. She made a mental note to visit the local grocery store later. But first, there was the matter of her new office. The only tangible inheritance left by her estranged grandfather, the office had been described as a relic from another time. Alicia couldn't remember much about the man who'd left it to her, only snippets of conversations overheard as a child, vague warnings and the occasional cryptic comment about his line of work. She stepped outside, greeted by the stillness of Blackwood in the early hours. The town's streets were empty, the storefronts lining the main road faded and worn, their signs swaying gently in the breeze. It felt like stepping into a photograph from decades past, the kind of place where time moved slower, if at all. Her office was easy to find, a modest brick building nestled between a shuttered diner and a pawn shop. The brass plaque on the door read Raine Investigations, the name barely legible beneath years of tarnish. She unlocked the door and stepped inside, greeted by the scent of old paper and leather. Dust motes danced in the air, stirred by her movement as she took in the space. A desk, an aging file cabinet, and a corkboard filled with yellowed clippings occupied the room. A single photograph sat framed on the desk. Her grandfather, standing beside a man whose face was scratched out. Alicia traced her fingers over the frame, her pulse quickening. She had no idea what she'd inherited beyond the building itself, but something told her the answers lay within these walls. Answers she wasn't sure she was ready to find.